History in print. Every story you're about to hear is real.
Good evening. This is History in Print. Tonight, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The year is 1890. The city is alive in ways that are almost too much to take in. 2 million people move through streets paved in cobblestone and lit by gas flame. Horse-drawn trolleys clatter past the grand, unfinished face of City Hall, still wrapped in scaffold and ambition. Coal smoke hangs over the rooftops of Kensington. The smell of bread and sawdust drifts through the stalls of Reading Terminal Market. This is the birthplace of American democracy, and in 1890, it is very much still deciding what that word means. 90 miles to the west, a different world runs on a different clock. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School sits on the edge of a quiet Pennsylvania town, regimented, spare. Its students, children taken from their nations, from their families, wake to bells and march in formation. Inside its walls, a small printing press runs. The newspaper it produces is called The Red Man. What the editors of Philadelphia printed about Native Americans in 1888 was very little. What the Red Man printed was something else entirely. It carried dispatches that the city's great papers set aside, stories of government orders, of burned homesteads, of citizens demanding to be heard. It was in many ways the most honest newspaper in Pennsylvania. In February of 1888, the Red Man turned its pages toward a question that had haunted this land for 2 centuries. In February of 1888, the Red Man turned its gaze toward a clearing near the Delaware River. Not far from where Philadelphia now hummed and rattled, in the neighborhood then called Kensington, there had once stood a great oak tree. It was here in 1682 that William Penn sat down with the Lenape people. No royal decree, no plenipotentiary pageantry, no sworn oath on any Bible, just men, beneath branches, speaking what the paper called the simplest of all languages, that of truth. Penn was not a military man, he was a Quaker, a man who believed that land could be shared and that a promise once made did not expire. The French philosopher Voltaire, a man rarely moved to admiration for anything English, called Penn's 1682 Compact the only treaty which was never sworn to and never broken. 200 years had passed since that oak tree. The paper asked its readers what had become of the promise made in its shade. The answer came not from an editorial, but from the desk of the President of the United States. Grover Cleveland was the 22nd president, a man of firm opinions and little patience for dissent. In the spring of 1888, the Indian Office, operating under his administration, had issued a sweeping order. Native languages were banned from every school receiving federal funding. No vernacular textbooks, no oral instruction in any Indian tongue. English, and English alone, would be permitted within those walls. The Philadelphia Annual Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church pushed back. They passed formal resolutions of protest and sent them forward. Cleveland wrote back himself. His letter went to Reverend James Morrow, Doctor of Divinity, of 71 Walnut Street, Philadelphia, a minister, a man who had stood before his congregation and called the order unjust. Cleveland's letter expressed, according to the Red Man, his surprise and his disappointment. What the papers didn't print was the full weight of what that letter meant. The President of the United States had not merely defended a policy, he had rebuked a church in Philadelphia, in the city William Penn built on the promise of conscience. The oak at Shackanaxon was long gone by then. So it seemed was what it once stood for. Inside that lantern-lit hall, the air was close and heavy with pipe smoke. The men and women who filled it had only recently cast their first ballots as American citizens. They had crossed into something new, and they were not willing to cross back. One speaker rose to address the crowd. The reporter covering the meeting, writing for the Red Man out of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, later admitted he had to pinch himself to be certain he was awake. What he heard that night did not sound like petition. It did not sound like appeal. It sounded like a demand. "We had no voice," the speaker declared. "Today we are Indian citizens. We have a right to be heard, and Congress must listen to us, not as beggars to be put off, but as men who vote to send congressmen to Washington." Fearful voices rose in response. Some warned that such talk would bring taxation. Others worried it would anger the government. But a leading man in the room stood up. He invoked an elder, a man he said knew no fear, and rose like a man to meet whatever came. The crowd quieted. Outside that hall, however, the record told a different story. The records show something else entirely. It was not outside critics who delivered the most damning account of what was happening to the Ute people of Colorado. It was the federal government's own Commissioner of Indian Affairs. In his annual report, the commissioner drew a direct line between the forced removal of the Utes and the massacre at Camp Grant and the atrocity at Sand Creek. Washington had indicted itself. The Utes had been removed to Utah in 1882. Some remained behind on ceded lands along the White River. They farmed. They petitioned for permanent homesteads. They were told the land could only be purchased. Congress was now weighing a bill to remove them entirely. A column of Ute families moved along a dirt road in the gray light. Soldiers flanked them on both sides. The Rocky Mountains faded into the horizon behind them. They had planted crops. They left them in the ground. Capea was not a warrior. He was a farmer, a man who had made a deliberate choice to take up the plow, to build something, to stay. His wife Natalie had made a home alongside him on that frontier ground, and somewhere along the way, Capea had given her a set of china. Fine dishes, a gift, the kind of thing that says we are here and we intend to remain. The raiders arrived without warning. They moved through the homestead with practiced efficiency, pulling furniture into the yard, stacking books, dragging out the wagon. Then they set it all on fire. As the flames rose, they shouted their verdict aloud. Capea had chosen plows over weapons. These things, they said, should follow him to the happy hunting grounds. Every implement, every page, everything he had built his life around. But the china was different. They carried Natalie's dishes out one by one and placed them on the pile before the fire took them. It was not chaos. It was deliberate. It was a message aimed at the woman who had arranged them on a shelf and believed they meant something. They drove off the cattle. Then they brought out the ponies, looked them over with careful eyes, and quietly tied them to their own horses. The ponies were worth keeping. The rest was not. A distant sound broke the silence, and the raiders rode off through the smoke at a gallop. Natalie came back to ruins. What the papers did not linger on was this.
Every word you just heard came from the original newspapers. Subscribe to History in Print, a new story from the American